Welcome to the boredom of interesting times. There is an old Chinese curse, about which nobody in China knows anything, so it's probably a Western invention, which says, "May you live in interesting times." Interesting times are times of trouble, confusion, and suffering. And it seems that in some democratic countries, we of late have witnessed a weird phenomenon which proves that we do live in interesting times. A candidate emerges and wins elections, as it were, from nowhere, in a moment of confusion, building a movement around his or her name. Both Silvio Berlusconi and Macron exploded on the scene like this. But what is this process a sign of? Definitely not of any kind of direct popular engagement beyond party politics. On the contrary, we should never forget that such figures emerge with the full support of the social and economic establishment. Their function is to obfuscate actual social antagonisms. People are magically united against some demonized fascist threat. In 1990, Václav Havel was the first to blurt out this dream. When, after being elected president, he first met Helmut Kohl, he made a weird suggestion. Why don't we work together to dissolve all political parties? Why don't we set up just one big party, the Party of Europe? One can imagine Kohl's skeptical smile. What this sudden rise of parties from nowhere, and with no clear program, indicates is the disintegration of the political space as we know it. Even if political parties remain the general frame of political life, it is as if they have exhausted their potential. Multiple options are possible here, which all hinge on how the new political antagonisms, populists versus technocrats, etc., articulate themselves. But what is clear is that there is no longer a proper political project to mobilize and organize people. If a new political project is to arise, it will have to come from the left. This weird phenomenon, one of the visible effects of the aforementioned long-term rearrangement of the political space in Europe, brings us back to Berlusconi and Macron. New movements emerge out of nowhere when none of the old big parties, conservative or liberal, succeeds in imposing itself as the agent of the new radical centre. So the establishment is caught in a panic and has to invent a new movement in order to keep things the way they are. The names of their respective movements, more than just parties, sound similar in their empty universality, which fits everyone and everything. Who wouldn't agree with Forza Italia or with La République en Marche? Both of which slogans designate the abstract sense of a victorious movement without any specification of the direction of the movement and its goal. Both came to the fore as reactions of the establishment in a panic. There is, of course, an obvious difference between the two, a different accent. Berlusconi entered the scene when, after the big anti-corruption campaign, the entire traditional political configuration in Italy collapsed, and ex-communists remained the only viable force, while Macron came to prominence when Le Pen's neo-fascist populism threatened to win the elections. His role is best described by a word used by some of his supporters. In recent years, Marine Le Pen has gradually been de-diabolized, perceived as part of the normal, acceptable political space, and the task is to re-diabolize her, to show the political public that she remains the same old anti-Semitic fascist, and as such is not to be tolerated by any serious Democrat. Such a gesture of re-diabolization is clearly not enough. Instead of just focusing on the diabolic fetish, one should immediately ask the question of how such a devil could have emerged in our society. In Le Pen's case, she is a reaction to the policy whose embodiment is Macron. The function of diabolization is precisely to obfuscate this link, to locate the guilt in an agent outside our democratic space. A classic liberal argument for voting for Clinton or Macron against Trump or Le Pen is that while it is true that what Clinton and Macron stand for is the very predicament that gave birth to Trump or Le Pen, not voting for Clinton or Macron is like voting for an actual disaster in order to prevent a possible future disaster. This argument sounds convincing, on condition that we ignore temporality. If Le Pen had been elected president in 2017, It could have triggered strong anti-fascist mobilization, rendering her re-election unthinkable. Plus, it could have given a strong push to the leftist alternative. So the two disasters, Le Pen president now, or the threat of Le Pen as president in 5 years, are not the same. The disaster after 5 years of Macron's reign, if it turns out to be a failure, will be much more serious than the one which did not happen in 2017. Historically, it was the task of the left to ask such questions, so no wonder that, with the enemy diabolized, the radical left conveniently disappears from the picture. Recall how, in the 2017 elections in France, every leftist skepticism about Macron was immediately denounced as support for Le Pen. So we can safely venture the hypothesis that this elimination of the left was the true aim of the operation, and that the demonized enemy was a convenient prop. Julian Assange recently wrote that the reason why the US Democratic Party's establishment had embraced the "we didn't lose, Russia won" narrative is because if they didn't, then the insurgency created by Bernie Sanders during the 2017 presidential election would dominate the party. And in the same way that the US Democratic establishment diabolizes Trump to get rid of Sanders, who poses a threat, the French establishment diabolized Le Pen to head off potential leftist radicalization. The title of Hadley Freeman's comment in The Guardian, the UK voice of the anti-Assange, pro-Hillary liberal left, says it all. Le Pen is a far-right Holocaust revisionist. Macron isn't. Hard choice? Predictably, the text proper begins with, is being an investment banker analogous with being a Holocaust revisionist? Is neoliberalism on a par with neo-fascism? And mockingly dismisses even the conditional leftist support for the second-round Macron vote. The stance of, I'll now vote Macron very reluctantly. This is liberal blackmail at its worst. One should support Macron unconditionally. It doesn't matter that he is a neoliberal centrist, just that he is against Le Pen. It's the old story of Hillary versus Trump. In the face of the fascist threat, we should all gather around her banner, and conveniently forget how her side brutally outmaneuvered Sanders and thus contributed to losing the election. Are we not allowed to at least ask the question, yes, Macron is pro-European, but what kind of Europe does he personify? The very Europe whose failure feeds Le Pen populism, the anonymous Europe in the service of neoliberalism. This is the crux of the affair. Yes, Le Pen is a threat, but if we throw all our support behind Macron, do we not get caught up in a kind of circle and fight the effect by way of supporting its cause? This brings to mind a chocolate laxative available in the US. It is publicized with the paradoxical injunction, do you have constipation? Eat more of this chocolate. In other words, eat the very thing that causes constipation in order to be cured of it. In this sense, Macron is the chocolate laxative candidate, offering us as a cure the very thing that caused the illness. Both candidates presented themselves as anti-system. Le Pen in an obvious populist way, and Macron by a much more interesting means. He was outside the existing political parties, but precisely as such, he stood for the system as such, in its indifference to established political choices. In contrast to Le Pen, who stood for proper political passion, for the antagonism of us against them, from immigrants to non-patriotic financial elites, Macron represented apolitical, all-encompassing tolerance. We often hear the claim that Le Pen's politics draws its strength from fear of immigrants, of the anonymous international financial institutions. But does the same not hold for Macron? He finished first because voters were afraid of Le Pen, and the circle is thus closed. Neither of the candidates offered a positive vision. They were both candidates of fear. The true stakes of this vote become clear if we locate it in its larger historical context. In Western and Eastern Europe, there are signs of a long-term rearrangement of the political space. Till recently, it was dominated by two main types of party, addressing the entire electoral body. A centre-of-right party, Christian Democrat, Liberal Conservative, People's, and a left-of-centre party, Socialist, Social Democratic, with smaller parties addressing a narrow part of the electorate, ecologists, neo-fascists, etc. Now progressively a type of party is emerging that stands for global capitalism, usually with relative tolerance towards abortion, gay rights, religious and ethnic minorities, and so on. In opposition to this party, there is typically an increasingly strong anti-immigrant populist party, which, on its fringes, is accompanied by directly racist neo-fascist groups. The exemplary case here is Poland. After the disappearance of the ex-communists, the main parties are the anti-ideological centrist Liberal Party of the former Prime Minister Donald Tusk and the conservative Christian Party of the Kaczynski brothers. The key issue for the radical centre today is this: which of the two main parties, conservatives or liberals, will succeed in presenting itself as embodying the post-ideological non-politics as against the other party, which is dismissed as being still caught up in old ideological spectres. In the early 1990s, conservatives were better at it. Later, it was liberal leftists who seemed to be gaining the upper hand, and Macron is the latest figure to represent a pure radical centre. Jürgen Habermas and Peter Sloterdijk, the two great philosophical opponents on the German scene, have recently rendered public their admiration for Macron in quite enthusiastic terms, as a new hope for Europe, even with hints that, in the way that Hegel, when he saw Napoleon riding on a horse in Jena, described him as the Weltgeist riding on a horse. The same holds for Macron, who is the embodiment of today's European Geist. When such radical opponents start to speak the same language, it is always a symptomatic point, not of their deeper unity, but of the rejection, repression that unites them. The rejection of a more radical left in this case. We have thus reached the lowest point in our political lives, a pseudo-choice if ever there was one. Yes, the victory of Le Pen would pose dangerous possibilities, but the assuagement brought by Macron's triumphant victory is no less dangerous, since his victory did not really awaken us. Its effect is quite the opposite. Sighs of relief everywhere. The nightmare is over. Thank God the danger was kept at bay. Europe and our democracy are saved. So now we can go back to our liberal capitalist sleep again. In the hopeless situation we are in, facing a false choice, we should summon up the courage simply to abstain from voting. Abstain and begin to think. The commonplace, enough talking, let's act, is deeply deceiving. Now we should say precisely the opposite. Enough of the pressure to do something, let's begin to talk seriously. That is, to think. And by this I mean we should also leave behind the radical leftist self-complacency of endlessly repeating how the choices we are offered in the political space are false, and how only a renewed radical left can save us. Yes, in a way, but why then does this left not emerge? What vision has the left to offer that would be strong enough to mobilize people? We should never forget that the ultimate cause of the vicious cycle of Le Pen and Macron in which we are caught is the disappearance of a viable leftist alternative. No wonder a new spectre is haunting liberal progressive politics in Europe and the US, the spectre of fascism. Trump in the US, Le Pen in France, Orban in Hungary. They are all demonized as the new evil against which we should unite our forces. Every minimal doubt and reservation about the alternatives we are presented with is immediately proclaimed as a sign of secret collaboration with fascism. In a remarkable interview with Der Spiegel, published in October 2017, Emmanuel Macron made some statements which were received enthusiastically by all who want to fight the new fascist right. There are three possible ways to react to right-wing extremist parties. The first is to act as though they don't exist, and to no longer risk taking political initiatives that could get these parties against you. That has happened many times in France, and we have seen that it doesn't work. The people that you are actually hoping to support no longer see themselves reflected in your party's speeches, and it allows the right wing to build its audience. The second reaction is to chase after these right-wing extremist parties in fascination. Der Spiegel. And the third possibility? Macron. To say, these people are my true enemies, and to engage them in battle. Exactly that is the story of the second round of the presidential election in France. While Macron's stance is commendable, it is crucial to supplement it with a self-critical turn. The demonized image of a fascist threat clearly serves as a new political fetish, in the simple Freudian sense of a fascinating image whose function is to obfuscate the true antagonism. Fascism itself is inherently fetishist. It needs a figure like that of a Jew, condemned as the external cause of our troubles. Such a figure enables us to obfuscate the imminent antagonisms that cut across our society. My claim is that exactly the same holds for the notion of fascist in today's liberal imagination. It enables us to obfuscate imminent deadlocks which lie at the root of our crisis. The desire not to make any compromises with the alt-right can easily obscure the degree to which we are already compromised by it. One should welcome every sign of this gradually emerging self-critical reflection which, while remaining thoroughly anti-fascist, also casts a critical glance at the weaknesses of the liberal left. See, for example, the extraordinary intervention of Susan Sarandon. Her claim is not that Me Too style political correctness goes too far, but that it is pseudo-radical, that its radicality is a pose. The task is not to build a coalition between the radical left and the fascist right, but to cut off the working class oxygen supply to the alt-right by addressing their voters. The way to achieve this is to move more to the left with a more radical, critical message, i.e. to do exactly what Sanders and Corbyn were doing, and which was the root of their relative success.